What's up guys, it's River, and today we're looking at my top 5 budget YouTube cameras. Now YouTube content is so diverse, so I wanted to pick cameras that did a little bit of everything but also had unique features specifically for YouTube. So let's do a deep dive, figure out exactly what each camera does, what makes it unique for YouTube, and of course, which camera is right for you. Let's get into it. So the first camera on the list is the Canon M50, and I think this is the camera that's probably the right camera for most of you. It's $650 with a lens and SD card. It has a 24 megapixel sensor, which is very middle of the road, but it does gorgeous Canon HD from 24 frames per second up to 60 frames per second, which is very useful. You can get real-time cinematic footage plus a little bit of slow motion. It does do 120 frames per second at 720p. Personally, I wouldn't use 720p for anything. I think it's a little too soft and low res. This camera does have 4K, however, it does 4K with a pretty significant crop. I wouldn't use the 4K for regular vlogging, but I would use the 4K for maybe specialty stuff like a time lapse, or if you wanted to do a wide shot that you could punch in later for different angles. Like if you're doing an interview with two people talking, you could shoot a wide with the 4K and then punch into different people's faces for reaction shots. What really makes this camera special is the color science. Canon cameras are known for their color science. The way this camera handles skin tones and color tones is just perfect. Everybody looks attractive. Colors appear vibrant and true to life. I feel like with Canon cameras, 70% of the work is already done for you, and you just need to fine tune and tweak your colors a bit. And especially if you're vlogging, you can literally take the footage from this camera, take it right into Premiere, edit it without any color correction, and you will be just fine. And of course, autofocus. This camera features Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is very fast and very reliable. In HD, you will have no problem whatsoever. This camera is really good at tracking faces, so if you sit in front of your camera or if you vlog with it, it'll be able to track your face, move in and out with you. In terms of shooting faces, this camera is very, very good, and it's pretty solid when it comes to object tracking. The one place that the autofocus does struggle is in 4K mode. Once you go into 4K, the dual pixel autofocus gets turned on, and you get this really abysmal form of autofocus that seems contrast-based. Either way, it's not really good. I really wouldn't use it. A camera like the M50 is really meant to be used in HD, and the 4K is more of a gimmick. As for the design, it's nice and light, it's very compact, and it feels very hassle-free to take around with me. It doesn't feel like much more work than just my cell phone. The two things that I really appreciate about this camera, which is key for YouTube content creation, is that it has an external mic input. You cannot do YouTube properly without solid audio, and it has a side flippy screen, which is a screen that comes out to the side. Makes it easy to see what you're doing. It has touch autofocus, all that good stuff. It just makes it that much easier to use your camera, especially when you're pointing the camera at yourself. It does lack a headphone jack, and while that's not ideal, it's not really the end of the world. Just be careful of the environment that you're recording and make sure there's no random noises around you. The overall design of the camera is super ergonomical. The grip is nice and deep. It fits perfectly in my hand. The button layout itself is perfect. The buttons are nice and clicky. Everything is just within finger's reach. I can work very, very quickly with this camera. But what I really appreciate about this camera is the touchscreen. It's nice and responsive, very quick, and I often find myself using the touchscreen more than the buttons themselves. And of course, the software in this camera is super easy to use. If you're new to cameras, you will not have an issue. And of course, the battery. The battery in this camera is not very big, but small camera, small battery, but they're pretty easy to get on Amazon. For about $35, you can get a 2-pack with a charger. Overall, my verdict on this camera is that it's a very, very solid camera. It's probably the camera that most of you guys are gonna use. If you're a makeup tutorial person, someone that talks about fashion, if you do any kind of educational content, or just anything like this where you sit in front of the camera and you talk to it, this camera will do great. The autofocus is reliable. The ergonomics of this camera are very easy. The side flippy screen is gonna make it that much easier to just frame up your shot and make sure you're always in focus. And also the audio preamps in this camera, fantastic. The next camera is the Sony A6400, and personally I think this camera is almost everything, but it is a little bit more expensive. It's $998, but with that you get a ton more horsepower than the M50. The A6400 has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, but don't let that small sensor fool you, because this camera does HD from 24 up to 120 frames per second at 100 megabits data rate. Plus, it's great in low light up to 20 to 30 ISO. On top of that, it has cinema profiles that are great for crafting a look, really doing some cinematic content. And as if that wasn't enough, this camera does phenomenal 4K at both 24 and 30 frames per second. And as if all of that wasn't enough, it features the new Sony Venice colors. Normally, I always say Sony colors don't look the greatest, and if you want good colors, you should go with Canon. But this has colors from the new Sony Venice cameras, which are Sony's bleeding edge, top of the line cinema cameras, which are actually being used to shoot Avatar 2 right now. So with those fantastic new colors, this camera is an absolute beast. Color grading with this camera is going to be that much easier. You're going to get way better skin tones. You're just going to get better images overall. And I'd love to stop the list of amazing things that this camera does there, but to be honest, there's more. The Sony A6400 features Sony new AI-based autofocus, which is autofocus that is actively tracking faces, eyes, objects, and it is just light years ahead of the rest of the industry. This autofocus is absolutely set it and forget it. It never hunts, it never really gets confused, and it even works in low light. If you're the type that doesn't want to have to mess around with their camera and just wants their camera to work, this might just be the camera for you simply because of the autofocus. Last but not least, the design. I love the design of this camera. The button layout is perfect and you can really fully customize every single portion of your camera to your liking. And on top of that, it has a flip-up screen so you can see yourself while you record. However, that flip-up screen does have a tiny downside. Normally, you would put your mic on top of your camera and that mic will block your flip-up screen. It's not too much of an issue if you're using a wireless lav because you could just put that on the side of your camera. If you are someone that's going to be using a shotgun mic on this camera, you can buy a $9 attachment from Amazon that lets you put your mic on the side of your camera. It's not the end of the world in my opinion, and to be honest, it's a small price to pay for all the things that this camera offers. However, the menus are very cumbersome. One thing that I like about Canon cameras is that the menus are nice and light. They're only a couple pages. Sony menus, you could probably get a university degree on them. There's tons of them, but if you're the type of person that really likes to get deep, really customize every nook and cranny of your camera, then you'll probably appreciate the deep menus. Personally, I'm a nerd and I love having 20 pages of menus. However, if you're feeling intimidated, not to worry, there's a simplified panel version of the menu that makes it easy for new users and beginners to pick up this camera. The only two downsides of this camera is that it does not have built-in stabilization. If you want a similar camera with built-in stabilization, I'd recommend looking into the Sony A6500. However, that camera does not have a flip-up screen like the A6400 and doesn't have the newest Sony colors. And second, this is similar to the Canon M50. It does not have a headphone jack. However, I don't think that's the end of the world. Just have to be a little bit more careful about your audio. The battery in this camera is typical that of Sony cameras. They only last between 40 minutes to an hour, but they're pretty easy to pick up on Amazon. You can get a 2-pack with a charger for only $30. Personally, I think the A6400 is the most powerful camera on this list, and it's really aimed towards anybody that wants to make a lot of cinematic content. If you're somebody that just wants to sit in front of a camera, talk, and you're just doing low-key YouTube stuff, I wouldn't recommend spending the extra money. I'd definitely go with the M50, but if you're somebody that knows they're gonna be out there getting cinematic stuff, really doing some heavy color grading in post, the A6400 is a great camera and I would not hesitate to buy it. And if you're sitting at home thinking, man, I really like the features and performance of the A6400, but not the price, stay till the end of the list because I have a camera that just might be perfect for you. And the third camera on this list is probably the most unique camera on this list. It's the DJI Osmo Pocket. It has a 12 megapixel sensor and in full HD, it does 24 up to 60 frames per second with a special mode that does 120 frames per second, plus it does 4K up to 60. But what really makes the camera special is the gimbal. It allows you to get perfectly smooth shots, basically any kind of camera movement you can think of. Plus, with that gimbal, it has face tracking, so you could just put the camera down on the table, walk around, and it will track you. And on top of that, it has the capability to do motion time lapses and panoramas. All of these are really unique tools that could really help to set your videos apart. The autofocus in this camera is pretty decent. It's not quite as good as the Sony or Canon cameras, but it will get you through your video. I wouldn't recommend doing anything run and gun with this where it's gonna be swinging around and going from subject to subject. So it's really more of a camera where it's gonna take slow moving stuff. Maybe if it's pointed at your face, it'll be just fine, or if you're tracking something from behind, you'll be just fine. A small downside of this camera is that it's not the best in low light. Personally, it's not the end of the world. With a small camera, you're generally not gonna get very good low light stuff. But if you're shooting in the daytime, indoors, or in the city streets, even at night, you'll get pretty decent images. The low light in this camera is about as good as your cell phone. As for the design in this camera, it's super small, super compact, and it's probably the easiest camera to take around with you. However, the battery in this camera does not last very long, and I do recommend getting the charging case because the battery in this camera only lasts about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Also, it does not have a built-in audio jack, so you do need to purchase a separate $53 attachment that allows you to have an audio jack. And if you're going to do anything for YouTube, you absolutely must have good audio. Overall, I think this is a really interesting camera. I wouldn't recommend this to somebody that is sitting inside of a room like this, talking to the camera or doing anything educational. I'd really recommend this to someone that's maybe a food blogger that's going to take their camera to a restaurant, that's going to be traveling and walking around, maybe if you're showing someone your city. It's really for anybody that does YouTube stuff that requires a lot of traveling. It's kind of the perfect mix between a vlogging camera and a travel camera. And even if you don't use this as your main camera, I highly recommend picking this camera up for just $399 and using it as your B camera or just as the camera that shoots all your specialty shots. Because this camera does have a lot of unique tools that I do think will help set your videos apart. The next camera on the list is the Canon 80D. Now this is really the workhorse of the list. If you're somebody that's a professional vlogger, is vlogging every single day, you're pumping out 3 to 4 videos a week, this is the camera for you. This camera features a 24 megapixel sensor and does full HD up to 60 frames per second, sadly no 4K. It features Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is very reliable and does a great job with face tracking. For 99.999% of you, this autofocus system will be just fine. However, if you want a little bit more horsepower, the Canon 90D, which is a slightly newer version of this camera, features full HD up to 120 frames per second and has 4K in both 24 and 30 frames per second. Plus, it's got a slightly newer processor, which gives it way, and I mean way better autofocus. It's amazing with face tracking. It's great with subject tracking. It is honestly one of my favorite autofocusing systems. If you have the money, feel free to get the 90D instead of the 80D. However, I think for most of you guys, if you're a vlogger or you're sitting down and talking to the camera like this, you'll be just fine. I wouldn't recommend jumping to the 90D unless you wanted 120 frames per second in full HD and you definitely needed 4K. And even then, I would probably still recommend the A6400, but really recommend the 90D to somebody that's shooting every day, a ton of content, needs all the bells and whistles, but also needs a camera with a professional style body and long battery life, which brings me perfectly to design. As for design, both the 80D and 90D are very, very similar. They both have a rugged DSLR style body that is made for video production. My favorite thing about this camera are 2 things. One, the headphone jack is perfectly placed to never hit the side flippy screen. So as you turn your screen or move it around, it will never hit the headphone jack. Plus, right on top of the camera is actually an LCD screen that allows you to see all of your settings right there at a glance. If you're someone that's doing video production all day long, you get tired, and it's sometimes even the smallest little change in your settings can ruin a shot. So being able to look down and just see where your settings are is magical. The 2 major benefits of having a DSLR style body is how durable your camera is and the battery life. This camera is weather sealed to go through anything. You can take it traveling, you can put it through moisture, you can really beat the crap out of it and this camera will hold up. And on top of that, it uses the Canon LP6 battery. A single battery will most likely get you through 6 to 8 hours of shooting. That's right, 6 to 8 hours. These things pretty much last forever. However, I don't recommend living your life with just one LP6 battery. Recommend picking up a few extra ones. However, make sure you get official Canon batteries because the off-brand batteries don't last quite as long. And for those of you guys who are using this camera for professional use, this camera does feature the Canon All-I codec. It's a professional grade codec that is much more efficient than the IPB codec. And if that sounds too nerdy, basically what it comes down to is it won't have a huge impact on your image quality, but it does make your render time and your editing faster. So if you're pumping out 3 to 4 videos a week, this will save you a ton of time. Overall, I think this is a fantastic camera if you're a professional. If you're not someone that's pumping out 3 to 4 videos a week, I wouldn't recommend this camera simply because it's so big and bulky. I would probably get a smaller and easier to handle camera, but if you're a professional, this camera is robust, has professional codecs in it, has professional features, and is really designed for video. It's an absolute workhorse, and you won't regret picking one up. And the next camera on the list is extremely user-friendly, the Canon G7X Mark III. This camera rocks a 20 megapixel sensor. While it's a bit disappointing that it's not 24 megapixels, I don't think anybody will notice those 4 megapixels. What I do care about is the fact that it rocks Canon HD. Canon HD is always sharp and very detailed. It goes from 24 all the way up to 120 frames per second, which is fabulous at this price point. Plus it does 4K at both 24 and 30, and all of that for just $750. And in case you're new to Canon cameras, Canon has the best color science ever, great skin tones, great hues, great saturation. Pretty much everything looks good on Canon cameras and you barely need to do anything. And of course, because it's a compact camera, it has a built-in non-changeable lens. The lens is a 24 to 100 millimeter lens, which is pretty wide and then pretty telephoto to get close-ups. You can kind of do a little bit of everything. And if you bought a DSLR equivalent of this lens, it would probably cost you a few $1,000s. And the lens is pretty fast. It has an aperture of 1.8 to 2.8, which is very good for a low light. So if you're someone that does a lot of low light shooting, this will get the job done. While this camera doesn't have the same ISO performance as a Sony camera, the fast aperture on this lens will kind of even it out. As for autofocus, it is fantastic. I was really surprised by how good the autofocus was, considering it's a small compact camera. It does a really good job with face tracking and tends to hold focus pretty well. It's not as quick as I would like to be, but over time, firmware updates are constantly coming out. When this camera first came out, the autofocus was really not good at all. And over time, Canon has taken steps to make the autofocus better and better. But if you're just sitting down in front of your camera, talking to it, moving in and out a little bit, or vlogging, the autofocus will more than keep up with you. And a big selling point with this camera is that it has built-in stabilization. Usually smaller compact cameras tend to get very shaky and have a lot of vibration. So having IBIS in this is a big, big help. So if you're walking around with this camera or vlogging with it, your footage will look very smooth. And IBIS isn't even something I find in the Canon mirrorless or DSLR. So having IBIS in this camera is a big surprise and a very, very good one. Last but not least, the design. The design of this camera is almost perfect and really seems to be laid out with YouTubers in mind. The buttons are laid out in a really ergonomic fashion, they're really easy to work with, and they're nice and clicky. Also, the buttons all have a sandpaper finish that makes it just a little bit easier to turn, especially when you're working with small buttons. This camera does have a flip-up screen. Unfortunately, it flips up to the top. The issue with that is you cannot put your mic on top of the camera and you have to put it to the side. Same problem with the A6400. However, considering everything this camera does, it's a very small price to pay. If you're somebody that's new to cameras or tends to struggle with technology, I'd probably pick up this camera simply because it's super easy to use. The big selling point of this camera was how small and compact this is. If you're somebody that has to travel with their camera or is a vlogger, this is a very, very lightweight and hassle-free camera. The battery life in this camera is kind of mediocre, but that's to be expected considering it's such a small camera. I did my research and on Amazon, you can pick up 2-pack with a charger for only about $45. Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out our top 5 budget YouTube cameras. If you are interested in picking any of these cameras up, check out the link down below for the best pricing on these cameras. And if you have any questions whatsoever, hit me up in the comments down below and I'll make sure to get back to every single one of you. As always, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me figure out what kind of content you guys like and what I should be making going forward. Until next time, guys.